Hello, friends. Welcome to the Thinning of the Veil podcast. I'm your host, Tia Smith, and I hope you enjoyed yesterday's episode where we discussed some of the symbolism and characteristics of our own temple worship in different cultures and in different places around the world. Today's story is going to be awesome for a lot of different reasons. I think sometimes when we talk about thinning of the veil experiences, most often they are personal. No one else is receiving the same revelation that you are, and it is kind of your interaction with those on the other side of the veil. Now, when it happens to several people and there are witnesses to it, that's when it becomes quite extraordinary. When we're talking about revelatory experiences, they most often happen, and I will say, I actually can't even put a percentage on it, but a very, very high percentage of those revelatory experiences that we can note in our lives are because we are involved in the gathering on either side of the veil. I, for one, did not receive revelation for my own self until I started gathering Israel. Then I got used to the language of the Spirit to me in testifying of those who needed help on the other side of the veil, which then translated into better revelation for me and my family on this side of the veil, and in knowing what the Lord wanted me to do. So when we're talking about trying to have revelatory experiences, parting of the veil experiences, if you will involve yourself, and I won't just say involve, immerse yourself in this work, that is where you will find the most extraordinary, mighty manifestations that you have ever thought possible in your life. Some are big and some are small, but they're all mighty in their own way. So this one took place in the 1920s. And one of the other cool things about this story was that it included a not yet president of the church, David O. McKay. And I'm going to leave the link for this article in the description. There's a lot more writing to it. I kind of condensed it a little bit. So you can go back and study it on your own. And remember, I always, always, always leave those links in the description, all of the citations, because as President Nelson encouraged us, we are not to be lazy learners or lax disciples. So I trying to provide all the information, but you've got to go and do the work and study yourself so you can gain your own testimony, because you can hear this podcast all day, but if you're not studying on your own and gaining your own testimony of it, then it really does you no good anyways. So it begins in 1920 through 21. David O. McKay, then a 47-year-old apostle, toured the worldwide missions of the church, beginning with Japan and Korea. He dedicated the land of China, which I don't know how many of you actually knew that the land of China has actually been dedicated for the gathering. But that has happened, and President David O. McKay was a part of that. So that is yet to come, my friends, in mass, which is something I'm way excited about for all my dear friends who have Chinese ancestors, where it's pretty difficult. But just note that that land has already been dedicated. He dedicated the land of China for the preaching of the gospel, visited Hawaii, returned briefly to Salt Lake City for the funeral of President Anthony H. Lund, and then continued through the South Pacific, Australia, New Zealand, India, and Europe. He was accompanied on this arduous year-long tour by Hugh J. President of Liberty Stake in Salt Lake City, and a member of the Deseret Union Sunday School General Board, of which President McKay was General Superintendent. Among the many spiritual manifestations that occurred during this world tour came a remarkable event during the 36 hours they spent on Maui. President McKay and Brother Cannon docked at Maui at 4:30 a.m., February 9th, 1921. Held a meeting at mission headquarters in the morning, and held another for members in the evening. During the afternoon, they visited the sites where Hugh J. Cannon's father, George Q. Cannon, had met Jonatana H. Napela, resulting in the first baptism in Maui and the organization of the first branch of the church in Hawaii, and where George Q. Cannon had also received intense spiritual manifestations. And just know that I am not Hawaiian, so I'm trying my best to say these words correctly. Hugh J. Cannon was greatly touched by visiting the sites associated with his father and on the grounds of the little chapel at PULEHU. President McKay felt inspired to offer a prayer of thanksgiving During that prayer, all 5 men were deeply stirred spiritually, and Brother Kailimai, speaking in Hawaiian to President Smith, said he had seen a vision. President McKay, after President Smith translated Brother Kailimai's words, did not interpret the vision, but confirmed its divine origins by affirming that the veil was very thin. Hugh J. who had been most profoundly affected during the experience, testified that at least for him, there had been no veil. So now we're going to read different accounts. Samuel Harris Hurst's account. Of the 5 participants, only David Kailimai, the man who saw the vision, left no personal account, either at the time or later. Abigail Kahanu Kailimai, who is both David's niece and his daughter-in-law, does not recall an earlier oral version or, in fact, ever hearing this experience from Elder Kailimai. However, Samuel Harris Hurst Jr. kept a daily diary and recorded the event within hours of its occurrence. Elder Hurst was then 36, a native of Cache Valley, and a widower. His wife had died a lingering death from heart disease shortly before, leaving him with a 10-year-old daughter, Inez. He had grave doubts about serving a mission under such circumstances, but had accepted the calling, at least partly because of his child's faith, even though he had to sell his farm to pay his expenses. His diary and his autobiography, written in 1958, breathe a solid, simple faithfulness that is very moving. He confesses that being called to Hawaii was quite a test to my faith. His patriarchal blessing had told him he would go to the land of my forefathers, which did not seem to be possible. He thought he would be too old to learn Hawaiian fluently, and adds with humility, I had desires to be a good speaker, and I could not see any development for me if simple natives were to be my audience. He wrestled with his doubts about whether his call had been inspired all the way to Hawaii. But when he saw Wesley Smith, the mission president, waiting for him on the dock, he recognized him as the man with whom he had labored as a missionary in a dream seen 2 years earlier. This dream had occurred a year before Smith had been called as mission president. With this, recorded Elder Hurst, I knew that some power other than that of man was having something to do with it. Elder Hurst also knew that he would be assigned to some island other than Oahu before President Smith made the announcements. So Elder Hurst actually had previous thinning of the veil experiences through a dream that helped him to know that he was supposed to be in Hawaii on his mission. So when Brother Kailimai had his experience, the Spirit then spoke and bore witness to Elder Hurst that what he saw and what he testified of was true. And this is what he wrote in detail. Elder Hurst's diary for February 8th, 1921, records the prayer under the pepper tree in simple prose but eloquent detail. He writes, Elder McKay, President Smith, and Canon, Elder Keola, and myself drove out to PULEHU, where President George Q. Cannon had his wonderful experience in the conversion of so many of the natives and the first to join the church. As we sat in the little ford in front of the meeting house there, President Smith related to us the story of how President Cannon, in 1850 or 51, had delivered his wonderful discourse in a little church which then stood on the ground we were then on. At this meeting, he appeared to be standing in the air with a halo of light around his head. At the same time, all but 3 of the over 100 persons there present were transfigured before him. Brother Hugh J. Cannon, being a son of President Cannon, was very deeply affected, more so than anyone I have ever saw before. We then alighted from the car and walked around the grounds. At the rear of the old church on the grounds, now in the shade of an old tree, Elder McKay said, quote, Brethren, I feel impressed that we should render our thanks to the Lord for the labors of this great man and his co-laborer, President Joseph F. Smith, whose sons are represented here today. At this, we bowed in humble reverence in prayer to God, and then I listened to one of the grandest prayers it has ever been my privilege to listen to. At its close, Elder Keola testified he saw a hand and arm extended to me in an attitude of shaking hands. In speaking of this later, Brother McKay said, "Brother Keola, I do not know the significance of the hand you saw, but I know this, that the veil between us and the other world was very thin." Brother Cannon then said there was no veil at all, at which the apostle cast a penetrating look at him, for he, as well as we, seemed to be in doubt as to whether Brother Cannon had beheld a vision or not, but no more was said at that time. In closing his remarks in a general meeting held at Waluku tonight, Elder McKay made mention of this again, and with tears in the eyes of both men, he turned to Brother Cannon and, stamping on the shoulder, said, "My brother, you have been closer to your father, capital F, today than you have ever been before." Let's jump to E. Wesley Smith's account. He writes, Elders McKay, Cannon, Samuel H. Hurst, Keola, Kailimai, who is a local, and I visited the spot in PULEHU, Kula district, where President George Cannon had a wonderful manifestation in company with the noble chief Napela. While there, Elder McKay said he felt impressed with the desire to offer a prayer to the Lord in the spirit of thanksgiving for the privilege they had in being there and for the many souls who had embraced the gospel. We bowed our heads, Elder McKay being mouth. It was a moment never to be forgotten, for indeed the spot is sacred. Elder McKay said, "I feel certain that President Cannon and President Smith are near, for the veil was very thin." Elder Cannon was deeply impressed, and with tears filling his eyes and a choked voice said, "There was no veil." Now we're going to jump to Hugh J. Cannon's account. "I felt that I was treading on holy ground, that the veil between me and my father was very thin. Indeed, I felt that there was no intervening veil. The brethren partook of the same feeling. We had prayers under a tree back of the building, and Brother Keola, Kailimai, says that while we prayed, he saw two men shaking hands. He thought I was shaking hands with Brother Hurst, and was surprised when he opened his eyes to see me standing with my hands at my side. I do not know the significance of what he saw, but I do know that Father," referencing George Q. Cannon, "and President Joseph F. Smith were there." Although the date when Hugh Cannon wrote his narrative is not known, it would have been within the next few years, for the typescript was finished and corrected before his death in 1931. In that narrative, Hugh Cannon explains significant experiences of his father that had already hallowed this site. This is what he wrote. "Where George Q. Cannon and Brother Napela preached with such power that 97 of the 100 people who came to hear them were converted. The tradition is that Brother Cannon was not standing on the ground on this occasion, but was in the air, and that a great light shone about him. Under a beautiful tree on that lot where this occurred, and where the church now has a neat little chapel, the visiting brethren engaged in prayer. It was an occasion which none of them will ever forget, for they stood almost in the visible presence of celestial beings. In looking back on the trip after the lapse of several years, there are few, if any, experiences which are more impressive than this." So we're seeing this experience of past relatives of the men standing there in thanksgiving for the gathering of Israel work that they did, which also had its own thinning of the veil experience. And I will go into that story in more detail later. But this was a son experiencing his father on the other side of the veil, as the other ones in the circle did as well. This is truly sacred ground, and these spiritual manifestations were witnessed by several different people. So now I wanted to go into David O. McKay's early accounts, because he gave several different accounts of this particular experience. "It seemed to me that we were treading on sacred ground, for surely the Lord was the close companion and guide of that intrepid and faithful missionary, George Q. Cannon." And I will, as a side note, testify that as I've studied George Q. Cannon and his experiences, he truly had a gift for it, but I believe it was because he had so many experiences that he was blessed because he was a powerful missionary. David O. McKay then says, "We offered a united prayer on the ground, during which Brother Keola seemed to see two men shaking hands. He thought Hugh J was shaking hands with Elder Hurst and was surprised when he opened his eyes to see Brother Cannon standing with bowed head and closed eyes. I do not know the significance of his manifestation, but I do know we all felt as though President Joseph F. Smith and George Q. Cannon, two of the intrepid missionaries of early days, were well pleased with our visit and service on that memorable spot. It's important to note here, my friends, that each person had a different experience. Some saw, some felt, some heard. Those are evidences of the different ways that we can have these experiences and in different ways that they will be manifested to us. David O. McKay writes, 2 months later, speaking at a conference of missionaries and members in New Zealand, he retold this story. This time he reported that the two men in a position of handshaking were President George Q. Cannon and Brother Hurst. This experience is also the only time when the event is attached to a social and doctrinal message. The saints had been the focus of considerable proselytizing zeal from other denominations, and hecklers had interrupted that very session of the conference. President McKay reassured the saints that they were in the true church by telling the story of the prayer under the pepper tree. When he reached the point where Brother Cannon, with tears in his eyes, said, "There was no veil," he ended the narrative but added this commentary. The testimony of his vision is too sacred to give. But let me tell you, my beloved brethren and sisters, his father, George Q. Cannon, and Joseph F. Smith, nephew of the prophet Joseph, who presided over this church as the divinely authorized successor to the presidency of this church, let me tell you that they live, and these men gave approval of the work now known as Mormonism, which you, brethren and sisters, have embraced. God keep you to it, and may you know when wolves have entered in among you, even though they have sheep's clothing. Amen. So that particular account that David O. McKay gave was actually related to a doctrinal discourse that he was given, he was teaching in New Zealand. We then hear another account of this manifestation that President David O. McKay related. In this funeral sermon, President McKay, with great warmth, called Brother Cannon, Hugh J. Cannon, a friend. None truer, none more faithful in all this world, and distinguished for his implicit faith in the gospel of Jesus Christ. In this context, then, President McKay retold the story of the prayer under the pepper tree. So now he's actually speaking at a funeral, at Hugh J. Cannon's funeral, the one that said there was no veil. This is what he told about that story. We approached the missionary field made almost sacred by the labors of his father, President George Q. Cannon. I shall never forget the emotions that stirred Brother Cannon's heart as we neared the island on which his father had translated the Book of Mormon into the Hawaiian language. Brother Cannon told me about some confidences that his father had given him, his son, which had never been printed. I had never heard them before. On one occasion, George Q. Cannon, crushed and discouraged, heard the voice of God. So now we're hearing just a small snippet of George Q. Cannon's testimony of his own thinning of the veil experiences. He then writes, after the sight, we withdrew a short distance under a pepper tree and there bared our heads in thanksgiving and praise to God and asked his guidance upon our further travels. I haven't the time to tell you what happened or what vision came to Brother Keola, a native missionary. But after amen was said, I opened my eyes, and Brother Wesley Smith, a son of President Joseph F. Smith, who was also deeply impressed on that occasion, and others came up and said, do you know what Brother Keola was just telling us? No. Then I repeated what Brother Keola had seen during that prayer. We were silent for a few moments, and then I said, Brother Keola, I do not know the significance of that vision, but this I do know, that the veil between us and those intrepid missionaries, President Smith, George Q. Cannon, and others, was very thin. Brother Cannon, who was by my side, whispered, Brother McKay, there was no veil. Not to him. It just seemed as if he had looked into the other side and felt the presence of his illustrious father and President Smith, who it seemed were sharing the experiences of these modern missionaries in that land those first missionaries loved so well. So I imagine that in this particular time and opportunity, not only being a father-son relationship and they're on opposite sides of the veil, but when the son is engaged in the work of the father, they're aware of that and they are given time to time opportunities to connect with their family on this side of the veil because of the work. A little bit later, President David O. McKay reenacted this experience. Another account has been preserved, and it is by far the best known since it has been published as part of the inspirational stories of President McKay. Returning to Maui in 1955 as president of the church, President McKay reported and reenacted this experience on the grounds of the PULEHU Chapel for his party of 44. He first recounted George Q. Cannon's experiences, then recalled the 1921 visit with Hugh J. Cannon, E. Wesley Smith, Samuel Hurst Jr., and David Keola Kailimai. As President McKay spoke, D. Arthur Haycock, then president of the Hawaiian Mission, dropped to one knee, put his steno pad on the other, and took the account down in shorthand. This account has circulated widely, both in typescript and in its published form. This is the quote. "We became very much impressed with the surroundings, association, and spiritual significance of the occasion." President McKay remembered, and that's an important part, because the gathering of Israel helps us to practice the doctrine of remembering, that also enables the veil to become thin. It's in remembering that we can have these sacred opportunities. Sometimes we get so busy in our life that we don't remember our past. We don't remember those who have gone before and the work that they were involved in. And when we do remember, it gives us an opportunity and them an opportunity through the Spirit to have experiences with each other that your relationship can grow. I'm going to continue on with the account. I offered the prayer. We had all closed our eyes, and it was a very inspirational gathering. As we started to walk away at the conclusion of the prayer, Brother Keola Kailimai took Brother F. Wesley Smith to the side and very earnestly began talking to him in Hawaiian. Brother E. Wesley Smith said, "Brother McKay, do you know what Brother Kailimai has told me?" I answered, "No." Brother Kailimai said that while you were praying, we all had our eyes closed. He saw two men who he thought were Hugh J. Cannon and E. Wesley Smith step out of line in front of us and shake hands with someone, and he wondered why Brother Cannon and Brother Smith were shaking hands while we were praying. He opened his eyes, and there stood those two men still in line with their eyes closed just as they had been. He quickly closed his eyes because he knew he had seen a vision. Now, Brother Hugh J. Cannon greatly resembled Brother George Q. Cannon, his father. Of course, E. Wesley Smith has the Smith attribute, just as President Joseph Fielding Smith has it. Naturally, Brother Keola Kailimai would think that these two men were there. I said, I think it was George Q. Cannon and Joseph F. Smith, two former missionaries to Hawaii, whom that spiritual-minded man saw. We walked a few steps further, and I said, Brother Kailimai, I do not understand the significance of your vision, but I do know that the veil between us and those former missionaries was very thin. Brother Hugh J. Cannon, who was by my side with tears rolling down his cheeks, said, Brother McKay, there was no veil. I hope that as we read these stories and these testimonies of these experiences, that you are starting to gain faith in your understanding that they are part of the work of the gathering of Israel. It is a work that necessitates angelic help, angelic manifestations, and that as we learn the doctrine and the patterns, and as we hear stories, that will bring us to our knees, offering those intercessory prayers, asking Father who we can help, who we are supposed to influence on this side of the veil to help those on the other side. And angels and visions and dreams and spirit-to-spirit communication, still small voice, as evidence in this account that it was presented to each person in a different way, and yet they all testify that the veil is very thin. I hope that this will add to your testimony that it can happen to you in your life, and that it will happen to you in your own life in some form or another, and that as you have one experience, it builds to the next and to the next and to the next until the full pattern reveals itself. This is how it's been done since Adam and Eve. Angels have always been called upon to minister, as testified from Adam and Eve. That's how they learned these things, was from an angel. You and I are also their children, and God is no respecter of persons. Therefore, my friends, please have faith and know that as you gather Israel, you can and get to that point to where there is no veil, as testified by the brother of Jared. Thank you for joining me today. Please join us tomorrow for part 2 of Colette and her dream, her revelatory dream, her spiritual manifestation, and how she found out how to help that family through stories, family search stories, and a couple of other ways. I love that she is showing you many different ways to approach family history work and finding your ancestors. And then Friday, another talk that I hope that you are utilizing, my friends. I've said over and over again, maybe I should just, because it's a lot of work for that in particular. You don't know how many talks that I go through to land on that one. And I know that I'm hoping that it is helping someone out there understand this gathering better, because I don't want you to take this testimony just from me. So have a great week. And then next Tuesday, so excited, Darren Perry's coming on. He's going to testify of his own ancestral ceremonies that relate to our temple worship. And he will also tell the story of his Shoshone ancestors who had spiritual manifestations that brought them into the gospel and helped build the temple. So I'm super excited about that. And again, like, subscribe, and share this video. We'll talk to you soon, my friends. Bye.